So excited to be with you. My name is Rachel Gottfried-Clancy. I'm the interim executive director for Jewish Liberation Fund, while our ED, Joe Ware, is out on parental leave. We're so excited to be co-hosting this with IfNotNow and co-sponsoring with Jewish Currents. For those who don't know, Jewish Liberation Fund is a philanthropic fund that aims to nurture a progressive, vibrant Jewish movement composed of people with different experiences, identities, and supports organizations that leverage a multitude of tactics in an effort to promote a Jewish future that we believe in. We want to sustain growth and promote a vision of intersectional liberation and justice. In order to do that, we think it's really important to have difficult conversations and talk about kind of current context and moments. The folks that we've assembled here with the Jewish Currents are incredible thinkers on anti-Semitism, and we're so appreciative to have your voices in this discussion. I'll pass it over to Mari, who will be hosting and moderating, and wanted to just send a note that at the end, we're hoping to have time for questions. You're welcome to put any questions in the chat throughout the event. I'll be looking for them. And if there's a question that you would like to keep private or anonymous, feel free to private message me those questions. You can do so by finding my name in the participant box and then clicking the direct message button. We're excited to jump in, and I'll pass it over to you, Mari.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mari Cohen. I am assistant editor at Jewish Currents. Really excited to see you all here. Thank you so much for coming. So to talk a little bit about what we'll be going into tonight. In recent years, anti-Semitism has become a major topic in American Jewish life and around the world. Most American Jews, according to recent comprehensive Pew survey results, believe that anti-Semitism is on the rise. Yet increased attention on anti-Semitism has revealed sharp political divisions over the nature of anti-Semitism and varying motivations for campaigning against it. I'll quote Omar Bartov, a leading Holocaust scholar at Brown University, from an interview I did for an article on US State Department anti-Semitism envoy Deborah Lipstadt. When you talk about anti-Semitism, depending on what you're talking about and who you're talking about, it can be used for totally different political agendas. In fact, opposite political agendas, he said. In fact, much campaigning against anti-Semitism has focused specifically on fighting anti-Zionist politics and pushing back on Palestinian activism, defining any political disagreement with the existence of a Jewish nation state as ipso facto anti-Semitic. The approach that defines anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism has received support from governments and elected officials. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, known as IHRA or IRA, includes a list of examples of anti-Semitism that includes certain types of anti-Zionist speech and has been adopted by governments around the world, including the US State Department and by various universities. This campaign to define anti-Zionist politics as anti-Semitism has been led by well-funded organizations, from major long-standing Jewish communal institutions to a crop of new digital-focused groups like Jew Belong and StopAntisemitism.org. Major donors often have considerable power over how these groups operate. A 2021 investigation by my colleagues at Jewish Currents found that, for example, the Anti-Defamation League, the chief mainstream organization fighting anti-Semitism in the US, has frequently been lobbied by its donors to adopt more conservative positions. On today's panel, we'll talk about how philanthropic influence has shaped how we talk about anti-Semitism in settings from the government to academia to social media, including how the structure and goals of philanthropic involvement in anti-Semitism campaigns has changed throughout American history. In such an environment, what does it mean to advance different ideas about what constitutes anti-Semitism? I'm thrilled that joining us today are Matt Berkman, Shaul Magid, and Lara Friedman. Matt Berkman is visiting assistant professor of Jewish studies at Oberlin College. Matt is a political scientist specializing in American Jewish history, race and anti-Semitism, and US engagement with the Israel-Palestine conflict. He is currently preparing a book manuscript based on his dissertation, Coercive Consensus, Jewish Federations, Ethnic Representation, and the Roots of American Pro-Israel Politics, which won the 2020 Walter Dean Burnham Award for Best Dissertation in Politics and History from the American Political Science Association. Lara Friedman is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. With more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena, Lara is a leading authority on US foreign policy in the Middle East, with particular expertise on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the US Congress. Lara is also a contributing writer at Jewish Currents and a non-resident fellow at the US Middle East Project. Shaul Magid is a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College and Kagod Senior Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Author of many books and essays, his latest books are The Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament, Elijah V. Soloveitchik's Commentary to the Gospel, Piety and Rebellion, Essay in Hasidim, and Meir Kahana, The Public Life and Political Thought of an American Jewish Radical. He is presently working on the political theology of Joel Teitelbaum of Satmar. So those are our panelists. I think everyone's gonna have a lot of really great stuff to say. And so let's get started. To begin and sort of give us a place to start, I wanna turn first to Lara and ask Lara if you might be able to help us lay out the landscape of some of these anti-Semitism organizations that currently are at play in this political world. Can you give us a few examples of some of these big organizations and their political approach? And do these organizations tend to have funders in common?
Sure, and I'll do my best to answer the parts of that I know. And first I want to thank the organizers for this event. It's terrific and it's timely, and I'm humbled to be on this panel of learned scholars. I should say that you gave my resume. The reason I'm on this panel is because I track this stuff somewhat obsessively, and anyone who has followed me on Twitter or follows the research that I publish, the advent of the various campaigns to, as Mari said, use the IRA definition as maybe the knockout punch to try to shut down criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism is something that I've been following closely since it really came into the policy space. I think for me to understand this really, I think it's first important to sort of situate why this is happening, right? In very broad terms, at least in Washington. I can speak to Washington and how these organizations operate as sort of lobby groups. And it is not new for folks to try to use anti-Semitism or instrumentalize anti-Semitism, or I will dare say weaponize anti-Semitism to quash criticism of Israel. What we've been seeing, though, since I would date it to around 2016, is a real doubling down on that in the organized Jewish community. And I would argue if you sort of take that timeline and lay it on top of the death of the peace process and the rise of the Netanyahu era and the growing schism between Jewish Americans who are largely progressive and the Netanyahu era, and then add in a pinch of Trump politics, and you get a crisis, right? Where it's a crisis of, my goodness, how do you keep Jewish Americans on board? Because the policies of Israel are increasingly impossible to convince most Jewish Americans to defend, let alone support, or support, let alone defend. And anti-Semitism is a really effective, way of doing that, rallying it. And we saw this start with the organizational Jewish answer to BDS. I think that was really the roots of the current moment, where you had across the entire political spectrum of Jewish American organizations, the embrace of the idea that BDS is ipso facto anti-Semitism, and right, left, center, we can all sit under this umbrella comfortably, right? And then that starts to evolve. And I sort of, I go back and look at the dates. And I look at, for instance, the introduction of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act in Congress, the first time we saw legislation to try to take the IRA definition or something of that, like the IRA definition, and make it law. And that was actually in December 2016, which coincides not all that far from the beginning or the heart of the Corbyn crisis in the UK, when I think there was a realization that anti-Semitism can be politicized to enormous effect, right? It can be used with enormous effects in the political context. And as you look at that, and you look at, and Mara, you asked for examples, and I actually have a table, so I'm reading from my table. But if you look at some of the groups, so you have like stopantisemitism.org, and this is largely a digital grass tops organization. That's something we have in common with all of these groups. They're groups that look like grassroots organizations. And I should be clear, I mean, maybe they have more support than I can see. From what I can see as a researcher, looking at their Facebook presence, at their Twitter presence, at their press releases, these appear to be grass tops organizations. Stopantisemitism.org, which Their first Twitter account came out in October 2018. A second Twitter account came out in July 2019. Those are both still active, by the way. And that's an Adam Milstein operation. Adam Milstein should be very, familiar to anyone who follows funding of Jewish organizational politics. He is a proud funder of right-wing Jewish political causes. I don't think he'd be upset to be associated with this. I mean, he's obviously associated with it if you track it back. And then you get groups like Combat Antisemitism, which again, this started on Twitter in April 2019. They've got a robust website. And if you track that back, you find links to another very wealthy Jewish philanthropist named Adam Barron, who's also very right-wing. Another one is Together Beat Hate. It's called TBH, and that tracks back to Kraft Philanthropies. Another one is Americans Against Antisemitism, which is Dov Hikind from New York. It's his game. And another one's like the Antisemitism Accountability Project. These all exist in the digital space to make it appear that there is a wall of sound opposing anti-Semitism, right? It is a cacophony of outraged voices. Anti-Semitism Accountability Project is Ron Lauder's project. Or you get the End Jew Hatred, which puts out a lot of press releases. That started in August 2020 on Twitter, and that's Brooke Goldstein from the Lawfare Project. The bottom line is what all these groups do, and there's, it isn't clear. The question, I know this panel is about money. I have to say, it's not entirely clear to me how much money goes into any of this. It doesn't cost that much to get yourself a website, to set up a Twitter account, and to pay somebody whose main job is to put out press releases, which then, get picked up by JNS and then get, put out to the world. It's actually not a super expensive thing to do, but it is the same people over and over. And if you look at those people and see what else they're funding, it's not surprising that they're also funding not just maybe the ADL, not just AIPAC, but also maybe the Tikva Fund or things even further right. So it's part of an ecosystem of organizations which have, some of them, very little in common in terms of their activities, but what they do have in common, certainly dating back to the 2019 and forward, is this fundamental decision that prioritizing and elevating anti-Semitism, redefined to focus almost exclusively on criticism of Israel, BDS, anti-Zionism, is the answer. It is the answer to their organizational problems, to Jewish continuity, to support for Israel. And it's also been an extraordinarily effective political card, because a lot of the names I mentioned, a lot of the people associated with these groups are actually on the right, which puts them out of step with most Jewish Americans. And this is something, and we can talk about this later if you want, which progressive political figures and the Democratic Party has been unable to answer, right? The answer generally has been, we absolutely, of course, stand with you. If anything, we stand to your right, because that's how much we hate anti-Semitism. And if you say that the biggest problem is left-wing anti-Semitism, we're going to say, yes, it's a terrible problem, and point at something else, as opposed to, no, you are creating a red herring for political purposes. I can stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Laura. That's really helpful. I think that really helps give us the lay of the land. And obviously, as Laura noted, there's changes that have happened in recent years, current trends that we're looking at. But obviously, the phenomenon of American Jewish organizations and philanthropists kind of involved in advocacy around anti-Semitism is not necessarily a new one. And so I think now that we have a sense of what's going on now, it'll be interesting to talk a little bit about some of the history of this kind of advocacy. And so I want to turn to Matt for this next question, which is, what did it look like when the Jewish community initially consolidated a political advocacy voice on anti-Semitism in the 1950s and 1960s, and what role did philanthropic institutions play in that? And then I also want to ask after that, how did that then change in the 1970s and 80s to kind of get us closer to the model that we see today?
Great. Thanks for having me. I really admire all of the people on this panel, and I, of course, love Jewish Currents, so I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the question. Yeah, all of this stuff that Laura just mentioned, I think if you look back at the American Jewish history piece of this, you can see that kind of the moment that we're in right now is kind of a return to a communal structure that existed at the beginning of the 20th century, close to the end of the first Gilded Age. We're now in the second Gilded Age. That was back then was the first Gilded Age, when the first American Jewish defense or community relations organizations started to emerge. And back then, like today, there was enormous amounts of wealth and income that were concentrated in relatively few hands that gave a small number of private individuals kind of extraordinary power to engineer American society in ways that fit their ideologies and interests. In the early 20th century, just in general, American society saw the rise of the country's first mega foundations, like the Russell Sage Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, et cetera. And what was true of American society in general was also true specifically of the American Jewish population. And while the state of Israel obviously didn't exist back then, the need to counter or alleviate the effects of anti-Semitism was from the beginning a central, if not the preeminent kind of concern of early 20th century American Jewish philanthropists. As many of you, I'm sure, know from your own family background, from the 1880s to the 1920s, millions of Eastern European Jews immigrated to the US to escape poverty and anti-Semitic violence abroad. And this rapid influx was accompanied by a lot of anti-Semitism, new nativist racial anti-Semitism in the US, and in turn, a kind of a group of wealthy, assimilated American Jewish philanthropists, most of German Jewish heritage, talking about the Warburgs, the Lehmans, the Schiffs, and others like them, began to establish kind of this new Jewish social service infrastructure that was intended to uplift the Jewish immigration population. And without downplaying their genuine, concern that they had for the well-being of their fellow Jews, these early philanthropists were also motivated by their belief that in America, anti-Semitism was kind of the natural result of large concentrations of poor and culturally unassimilated Jewish immigrants. And so for that reason, they created these institutions not only to provide the essential services that poor immigrants needed, but also to kind of facilitate their cultural assimilation, what they call their Americanization, through education and through projects to disperse them throughout the continental United States. Organizations like the Industrial Removal Office did things like this. And so these philanthropists and their like-minded intellectuals and kind of professionals in this early period of the development of the communal infrastructure established the American Jewish Committee as their kind of political vehicle for conveying this view of anti-Semitism. And on that view, the way to keep a lid on anti-Semitism was basically for Jews to blend in with their Christian neighbors and to get rid of these old world ideologies like socialism, religious orthodoxy, and Zionism in particular. So, this view of anti-Semitism, it wasn't uncontested, but it was the dominant view of the most well-funded, kind of socially prominent American Jewish organizations for several decades. And then that began to shift in the 1930s. And the major kind of institutional vehicles for that shift were the Jewish philanthropic federations. Federations in every major city with any sizable Jewish population were established under the leadership of these old line philanthropists over the first several decades of the 20th century. And their goal was essentially to kind of centralize local Jewish charitable activity so that there wouldn't be so many people demanding so many things at once. Everybody would give to the Federation, and then the Federation would kind of strategically dispense the money in a way that was most effective. By the 1930s, you get this situation in which the federations are developing a kind of professional and bureaucratic autonomy. They're growing more independent of the original philanthropists that created and endowed them. And at the same moment, you have the rise of Hitler in Europe, which inspires a wave of organized anti-Semitism in the United States. And many people were coming to feel that a really kind of nationally organized Jewish response was necessary. So kind of long story short, and this is the stuff that my dissertation goes into, eventually book, hopefully one day, maybe, with the influence of these philanthropists kind of having been destroyed or reduced by the Great Depression, which wiped out a lot of big major fortunes, right? The Federation bureaucrats essentially took control of the situation and used their collective influence over the flow of charitable dollars within the Jewish community to essentially create the field of modern Jewish community relations or defense activities, as it was called, in the 20th century. And through their control of the purse strings, the federations did a number of things. First, they forced a kind of reconciliation of ideological differences between the three major national Jewish organizations. I already mentioned the American Jewish Committee. There was also the more middle-class Anti-Defamation League, also emerged around that time, and the kind of Zionist and ultra-liberal American Jewish Congress. And these groups were never quite able to get their act together before the federations came along and forced them to work together. And what emerged over the next couple decades was a new kind of more bold approach to fighting anti-Semitism through anti-discrimination legislation and litigation, and through education and advocacy that was aimed not at reforming the Jews, which is what the previous paradigm was about reforming the Jews, but at reforming society and challenging and changing the views of the non-Jewish public and the laws that supported them. And this was what I call it the liberal paradigm. It understood anti-Semitism not as this natural reaction to Jewish otherness, but as irrational prejudice that should be opposed alongside other forms of religious and racial bigotry. And it was what today we might call a more intersectional kind of view of anti-Semitism than the previous one. And it was what allowed Jewish organizations rather to be at the kind of forefront of the mainstream civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And one thing that's important for this story, I hope I'm not going on too long, but I'll coming to a close soon. What's important for this story is that the federations not only kind of forced cooperation between the national Jewish agencies, but it also forced them to work with and through a more grassroots, a genuinely grassroots political infrastructure at the time, namely this network of Jewish Community Relations Councils, or JCRCs, that each federation had kind of set up in its own city over the prior decades. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with the JCRCs, which still exist today, but their structure is a lot less grassroots than it was back in the 50s and 60s. Back then, Jews were kind of more densely organized at the local level in membership organizations, fraternal lodges, all types of things like this. And each of these were represented on the local JCRC, and then all the JCRCs were in turn connected through a national organization that is kind of the main character in my work, called the National Community Relations Advisory Council, or NACRAC. It's kind of a mouthful, but NACRAC is what it was called. And it was kind of like the umbrella body of all the Jewish community relations councils. And from the 50s through the 80s, NACRAC basically was a relatively internally democratic national voice for American Jews on issues of public concern. And it was the prime advocate of the liberal anti-Semitism paradigm. And so today, basically today, I'd say we are living in the wake of the collapse of the communal structure that was represented by NACRAC, and the wake of the rise of this third new anti-Semitism paradigm that is, we've heard it talked about already. It's centered on Israel and Zionism. It's often referred to as the new anti-Semitism. We're all familiar with that. And, philanthropy remains the dominant factor. It was always the dominant factor in efforts to fight anti-Semitism. It's still the dominant factor today, but it's in a new configuration. The breakdown of that old structure, that NACRAC structure, began in the 70s, and it mirrored really the breakdown of the New Deal order that had cemented American middle-class life since World War II. There was an onslaught of what came to be called the Reagan Revolution that increased corporate power, it made economic inequality surge, and led to all these new influential mega donors and private family foundations emerging, including Jewish ones. And through this process of concentration of wealth back at the top, federation leaders began to become increasingly dependent on these new concentrations of capital outside of their system. And they began stripping liberal JCRCs of their autonomy and deference to their more conservative donors. The national agencies like the AJC and the ADL, they kind of built up endowments and donor support outside of the old system. And the ADL in particular, as we know, was kind of one of the earliest advocates of the new Israel-centric paradigm, which it has long kind of fitfully attempted to square with its organization's, kind of historic liberal commitments. And so, in essence, and to conclude, the decline of that NACRAC system gave way to this less democratic and more decentered Jewish communal universe. It's one that, in addition to these old legacy organizations that are still around, AJC, ADL, et cetera, it's now populated by these organizations that Lara made reference to, these Israel-centric, foundation-funded or mega-donor-funded nonprofits that are, she called them grass tops. I put in the chat, I would call them AstroTurf. They're fake grassroots organizations, so it's AstroTurf. And these have paid staff members sometimes, but they lack any real constituency. And so today the relationship between the views of American Jews, the American Jewish population, and the views that are advocated by these many organizations is increasingly unclear. But to me, it seems increasingly unrepresentative because of these dynamics. So I'm sorry if I went over with my answer, but that's kind of my broad historical picture, and I won't say as much next time I talk.
Thanks, Matt. That's great. I think that's really helpful and pretty fascinating to really think about those different historical dynamics and how that influences where we are today. For the next question, I want to go to Shaul, and I want to ask a little bit about how some of these dynamics play out in the academy. One thing that I found very interesting in my own research on some of these issues is that oftentimes in the academy and Jewish studies departments, history departments, there's some pretty interesting kind of research and debate that goes on about the nature of anti-Semitism, definitions of anti-Semitism, history of anti-Semitism, as well as about Israel and Palestine. But at the same time, the academy is not, necessarily independent from political and from donor pressures as well, who, kind of increasingly, as universities are in some ways increasingly under the sway of large donors, as opposed to public funding. So yeah, I want to ask Shaul your thoughts on how discourse about anti-Semitism in the academy is impacted by donor pressure, and what impacts might this have on the future of Jewish studies if donors have a particular vision for how these things should go. And there are some major well-funded centers for anti-Semitism, for studying anti-Semitism at Yale and the University of Indiana. So what's their role in this field?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you, Mari. Also a shout out to Jordan at the Jewish Liberation Fund, who's been doing a lot of great work. So I want to get to the question, but I first want to I want to not respond, but I just want to add some of the things that Lara and Matt had suggested in terms of reflecting for a minute or two on why we are at the particular place that we are. I think that both Lara and Matt gave us really important historical context, and I wanted to give a more proximate historical context. There was a book written in the 1970s called The New Anti-Semitism, and this actually kind of, in a certain sense, began an entire new level of discussion about what anti-Semitism is. The book, The New Anti-Semitism, was focused primarily on the anti-Semitism on the left, particularly the anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Of course, it comes in the wake of the 67 war and the beginning of the occupation, and the way in which certain progressive movements, the Black nationalist movement and other movements in the student movements, really began to view Israel in a much more negative light as a result of the beginning of the occupation. And this continues on, and then it reaches a certain kind of turbocharged acceleration in the last 10 or 15 years, which brings us to this notion of definition. Like, why do we need a definition of anti-Semitism? Don't we really all know what anti-Semitism is? And of course, as you said, Mari, in the introduction, as Matt said, as Lara said, we're not really talking about anti-Semitism. We're really talking about the question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so the IRA document, the Jerusalem document, which I'm a signator on, that's really what the issue is. That's really what the question is. The second thing I wanted to say, and then turn to the question, is there's a distinction I think that's important to make between the increased acts of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism as a problem. Anti-Semitism becomes a problem not when there are anti-Semitic actors, but anti-Semitism becomes a problem when there's social tolerance for anti-Semitic acts. And I think it's arguably it's arguable to say that while there's an increase in anti-Semitic acts, there's not necessarily an increase in tolerance of anti-Semitism. In fact, you have states in the Midwest that have very small Jewish populations that are passing these anti-BDS laws. I think that it was Matt who said, right, the tolerance for anti-Semitism has not really increased, even though the acts might have increased. So I think there's an important distinction between those two things that's worth thinking about. In terms of the question that you asked about philanthropy and Jewish studies in the academy, it's a very interesting one because we've seen a transition in the last 15 years. If you were in a university and the dean told you that you needed to teach Jewish studies courses that were going to have a high enrollment, I think anyone out there that is in the academy will agree that what you did was you taught a course on the Holocaust. The Holocaust is what brought students in. That's where, and in a certain sense, that's where a lot of the money came from. I think that's changing. I think anti-Semitism, institutes for the study of anti-Semitism, courses in anti-Semitism, scholarship in anti-Semitism is primarily generated, at least in part, by the diminishing interest in the study of the Holocaust among a new student body. And this, in a certain sense, I don't think there's anything lamentable about this. I think this is just the nature of time. I mean, I think that students are now further away from the Holocaust. They don't know relatives who were survivors of the Holocaust. And in a certain sense, anti-Semitism comes in to fill that vacuum. So if you think about donors to universities, why would somebody want to give $3 million, $5 million to endow a chair in Jewish studies at a university? Generally, the assumption is that that's the best bang for their buck in order to maximize Jewish continuity. You have young Jews from the ages of 18 to 21 that are in university, many of whom don't have Jewish educations, many of whom didn't really learn that much about Judaism in their youth. And this gives them an opportunity to take Jewish studies courses, whether it's Jewish history, Jewish philosophy, and so on, or the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and become more educated as Jews so that they will, in a certain sense, on some fundamental primary level, marry Jews. I mean, in a certain sense, it's not so much different than all the money that went into birthright, right? It's the anxiety of intermarriage. I think the problem is that many of the people who are scholars of Jewish studies, and certainly Israel studies, and even scholars of anti-Semitism, are liberal, progressive, and are not necessarily teaching that which the donors want them to teach. But of course, universities have academic freedom and scholars can do what they want, teach what they want. So I think that you begin to see a certain kind of anxiety among donors that they're giving money for something that they didn't intend to give money for. Also, the large numbers of non-Jewish students that take Jewish studies courses, which is not why these Jews are giving millions of dollars to endow chairs or programs in the academy. So I think there's a lot of tension about that. I think the University of Washington thing with Leora Halpern about Israel studies is just one example of it. I think what very well might happen, is that donors who are in some sense usually either in the center or more on the political right will just stop giving money to universities, to Jewish studies programs, universities. The question is what will then happen? Will universities kick in with that money, or will these programs just become smaller and smaller? It's hard to say what's going to happen, but I think that the study of anti-Semitism and the academic subdiscipline of the study of anti-Semitism, which is quite young, is one way of trying to fill that gap. Except, again, the anti-Semitism industry is, battling with the anti-Semitism studies industry. And so you have institutes like the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism at Indiana University, or the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Yale University. It's hard to really determine what these institutes and what the anti-Semitism industry is really trying to accomplish, right? If we say that all of these institutes that you mentioned are trying to accomplish stopping anti-Semitism, fighting anti-Semitism, but what's the telos? What's the goal? Is the goal that there won't be any anti-Semites in America anymore? That's a futile goal. It's like saying that there won't be any racists, right? So it's not a question of erasing anti-Semitism. It's not clear what the question is exactly. I think that there's so much energy and resource into fighting anti-Semitism, but to what end? So that it shouldn't become political. I don't think it really is political. So it shouldn't become socially tolerant. I'm not really sure it is socially tolerant. Now, this, of course, separates the issue of anti-Semitism from the question of anti-Zionism or anti-Israelism. And I think that part of the reason that we wrote the Jerusalem document was because we saw that if the IHRA document was adopted, it would really make it almost impossible to be critical of Israel. Now, why is that so important for many American Jews? And I'll end here. It's that, as Lara and Matt said, most American Jews are liberal, progressive or liberal. What's happening over the course of the last 10 or 15 years is Israel is, and I don't think I'm being provocative here, Israel is an illiberal state. And it's becoming more illiberal as it moves along. So the question is, how does a liberal American Jew, how does a liberal Zionist defend an illiberal state? And one of the ways of doing that, and I think either Lara or Matt alluded to this, is raising the specter of anti-Semitism. That critique of Israel or critique of Zionism is anti-Semitism. But it arises, in my view, from an anxiety of American Jews not really understanding how they can defend a country that doesn't really embody their values, although they are still supportive of Israel and want to be supportive of Israel. So you deflect or you weaponize anti-Semitism in order to delegitimize what is, for many on the liberal progressive side, a legitimate critique of where the state of Israel is at this moment in time. I'll stop here.
Great, thank you, Shaul. I think that's really helpful and gives us that additional framing of like what's motivating some of this activism. I think that, thinking about that's a helpful jumping off point for one thing that I wanted to ask about, which is, to what extent does it make sense to think of this as a big donor problem as opposed to just a kind of a political problem in general? I think that, a few answers have sort of touched on this, but can we say that there is a big divide between these, these well-funded efforts around defining anti-Semitism, and that that's out of step with the average American Jew, and that it's sort of pushing forward a vision that's, not in touch with, a democratic vision of Jewish community? Or is that actually in line with what a lot of American Jews think and believe and prefer about anti-Semitism? I think that's an interesting question for us to think about. And Lara, maybe I'll start with you on that. You might have some thoughts.
Thanks, Mari. And I don't think there's an easy answer to the question you've just asked. I mean, fundamentally, what the battle here, it's a battle over narrative. It's a battle over the cognitive space of what is anti-Semitism, because it's really comfortable. And I say this thinking about a lot of my progressive Jewish friends who have spent years being deeply uncomfortable in the organized Jewish American community because they are progressive and they're worried about Israel and they're critical of Israel. And anti-Semitism, the industry of anti-Semitism has provided them a framing where we can all sit together, right? We can all be in this big tent agreeing that anti-Semitism is bad. It's bad on the right, which we all have no problem identifying, but it's also bad on the left. And they've this what I would view as an entirely manufactured false symmetry between Nazis and critics of Israel. It's really handy because at that point, once you've defined Nazis and critics of Israel, anti-Zionists are the same, you can just shorthand them as anti-Semites and move on, which is literally what is being done today. Is it a donor problem? Certainly. There is a lot of money in the past, certainly the past decade, going into, I'm not even talking about the UK piece of it, in the US, going into creating this ecosystem of organizations. And by the way, it's not just the AstroTurf digital organizations, it's an ecosystem of lawfare organizations. You know, everyone's paying attention to Arkansas this week, right? There has been, and again, this is something I track and report on obsessively, there has been now, you know, since 2016, a systematic effort to brand BDS, to delegitimize it and pass legislation to make it, if not illegal, to make it in some way marginalized and punishable in the US. And that relates directly to the IRA definition and the efforts to get, and we're hearing more and more again, a whole of government approach, right? Where the IRA definition becomes the definition that is used in every aspect of life. And really, just to touch on something that Shaul said, you know, the academy does have free speech, and there is obviously there's contention within the academy over how to teach, you know, Israel studies, Jewish studies. But the effort right now from those who are funding the "we must protect our Jewish students on campus" is not just about, you know, quashing Students for Justice in Palestine. It's about making sure that campuses adopt a speech code. The IRA definition adopted by universities is about adopting a speech code that applies to professors as well, students and professors. And if you think this isn't going to lead to lawsuits, then I would encourage you to look at the data online that I've published, that Palestine Legal has published, of these lawfare actors going after universities for allowing people to meet on campus, for showing films. I mean, this is, it's not that it's a slippery slope, there's a deliberate project here. The funding is a very big part of it. Not just you got the AstroTurf organizations, you have the ADL. I mean, you got to keep coming back to the ADL, which, you know, for years, for those of us who thought, you know, Abe Foxman was a real challenging leader of the ADL, for those of us who criticize Israel, you know, in his time at the ADL, former head of the ADL, Abe Foxman, drew a very firm line about not completely conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and trying to legislate against it. Since he left and he was replaced by the ostensibly more progressive new leadership, they've leaned in heavily. You can maybe get someone on the next webinar who is actually from the ADL, someone who used to work there, who can talk about the choices they've made internally. It's difficult to imagine that at least a major factor in these choices is not the funding factor. The last piece I want to mention on the funding factor, and I think it's important, you know, I keep coming back to BDS, and I think most people on the call know BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. This is the Palestinian grassroots movement to target Israel with boycotts, divestment, and sanction. You can like it, you can not like it, you can like the tactics, whatever. The point is that the Israeli government and the organized Jewish community really have rallied in a coherent way over the past 15 years to say, this shall not stand. This is a line that we are all drawing. To the extent of the Israeli government, until the most recent government, when they brought it, they created a ministry basically devoted to challenging the BDS movement. And this ministry, and I would encourage people, I actually just pulled up an article from the Forward from, I think, 2020, which is reporting on, you know, there was a information that came out from the Ministry of Strategic Affairs where they were funding, it was almost $500,000 to an organization called the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, which is based in New York. This is an organization that ostensibly is studying anti-Semitism and helping people understand and define it. And the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, in its effort to quash BDS, is giving them almost $500,000 in this year. And you know, it's not, these things are not disconnected. I said before about anti-Semitism being the knockout punch, and I mean it. My sense, as someone who's watched the various actors in the space, the people with the lawsuits and the legislation, is they can't figure out a way with free speech to shut down criticism of Israel. They can't legislate it against it, but they can call it anti-Semitism, call it hate speech, and that's the way they're going to get at it. And as long as Jewish Americans, and again, I think in the Trump era in particular, when there was this unbelievable tension for Jewish Americans who care about Israel, when Israel was aligning itself, you know, just without any daylight for the most illiberal forces in the US, making Jewish Americans, most of them, very uncomfortable. Fighting anti-Semitism, branded as, it must include criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism, became a very convenient place. And, you know, I think most of us who are more progressive, you know, during the Trump era, when I went to Kol Nidre services at an incredibly progressive congregation here in Washington, and in the little speech the rabbi gave, the first thing he did was tell us all we had to read Barry Weiss, How to Fight Anti-Semitism. That was from a progressive pulpit. That's what we were being told. I think those forces are such a challenge for progressives, and I don't think an answer has been found yet.
Sure. Matt or Shaul, do either of you want to jump in on any of that?
Matt, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, I think the original question was something like, is this a matter of, do Jews actually understand anti-Semitism this way, or are these top-down unrepresentative organizations pushing this agenda to redefine anti-Semitism? And I think, honestly, what you learn from political science education is that most people don't actually have a view on anything. Most people in America, and maybe in other parts of the world, have just very kind of vague notions of what things are, because they haven't sat down to really think about it deeply. And I think maybe the idea of what's the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism is not a question that most American Jews have very seriously contemplated. And the kind of answers to these questions are always generated from the top down. But the thing that was kind of best about the NACRAC structure that I've studied is that it actually gave a bottom-up venue where people locally could come and debate issues of concern at the national level, and those things would kind of like go up the pipe through the various channels, and there was also a national meeting where they would all convene. And so it actually created a democratic structure where people could think about these issues in the absence of any kind of democratic mechanism for debating issues and thinking about these things. And certainly besides Jewish Currents aside, maybe the Forward a little bit aside, most kind of newspapers that are controlled by federations, local Jewish newspapers, and they are often do not allow all voices to be heard, so those aren't really venues. In the absence of this infrastructure, it's really, we can't say what American Jews think. Even polls can't really get at the kind of intricate questions that require discussion and deliberation about these things. So what we need is, what you mentioned, Mari, is kind of a democratic infrastructure if we want to know what American Jews really think, some way of deliberating and talking about these things. But I don't think that is necessarily going to come into existence anytime soon. But in terms of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which Laura made reference to, I was looking just the other day at who lobbied for that, who was pushing it, who was not. And what I did notice is that the JCPA, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is the organization that NACRAC became after it kind of lost its more democratic functions, it became this kind of national convening space for the JCRCs, the local councils as they had come to exist in their less representative form. But they are still known to be on the both more left side of this Jewish political spectrum and to be more, kind of locally in touch with what's going on, what people think on the ground. And they, I noticed, did not endorse the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. The National Council of Jewish Women didn't endorse the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. They put out some statements saying, this is the IHRA definition is maybe a kind of a learning tool, but it is not necessarily should be used as a legal tool. And so it's interesting to see that there is not even amongst the institutions which were not democratically representative, there's still not a consensus among even the kind of major ones. And I'll stop there for now. Shaul wants to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to. This is all great. I wanted to throw something else in, which is a bit of a meta question, but I think it might help us kind of begin to think through this. And that is, why have American Jews become so obsessed with Israel? Why have American Jews become an Israel-intoxicated people? Why has the Zionist consensus, as it was usually called back mid-century, why has the Zionist consensus become a red line that separates the Jew from the Jewish heretic? because that's really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the question of a certain kind of contemporary secular heresy. If you're critical of Israel, somehow you're not a legitimate Jew, or as Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky said, you're an un-Jew, right? Which is a fascinating term, right? It's an interesting term of secular heresy. Why have we become that way, even against our own interests as American Jews, in terms of what it means to be a Jew, what it means to be an American, the interests that we have within American society? It's not clear how that's happened or why it happened. I mean, I have certain thoughts about why it happened, but not for now. But I think it really speaks to the issue and the obsession. And I use that word seriously, the obsession with Israel, both on the right and the left, by the way, but certainly on the kind of pro-Israel camp, is creating a situation where anti-Semitism is becoming weaponized, where self-hating Jews are becoming their own separate category, where, you know, people who support certain, you know, whether it's BDS, are not invited to the table of the Jewish conversation. This is a serious problem for American Jews. Israel has their own problems, and they're dealing with their own problems. But, you know, this is a serious problem. We have become obsessed. And I think the obsession is damaging not only to our sense of cohesiveness. I mean, I don't believe in Jewish unity, but our sense of cohesiveness, where in the 1960s, if a rabbi wanted to speak about a subject that wasn't controversial, he or she, in the 60s it was he, but would speak about Israel. Now rabbis can't speak about Israel from the pulpit. Israel is simply tearing American Jewry apart, when it was once something that actually brought American Jews together. And I think there needs to be a lot of serious thinking about historical context, about issues of weaponization, about fears and anxieties, about Israel is becoming the civil religion of American Jews, that really feeds into this, and also has an implication in terms of philanthropy and donors, and where donors are giving them money and why they're giving the money that they're giving.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's very helpful. I think that we're almost to the end. We're almost to 8 o'clock here. So, you know, I think maybe we will close it here, just because I think those responses have put a really great concluding point on this. And, you know, I hope that you all found this interesting. We're going to continue covering these issues at Jewish Currents, you know, from the politics of the AGL to the funding of these organizations to, you know, their role in lobbying for anti-BDS legislation, to these different debates over the nature of anti-Semitism. That's all definitely something that we're hoping to keep an eye on and keep in our wheelhouse. There will be a recording of this if anybody wants to revisit it. So I know that Jewish Currents usually puts the recording on our past, like in the events section of our website under past events. And I imagine maybe IfNotNow and Jewish Liberation Fund will be putting that on their website as well. So yes, and I think maybe Lara wanted to just add something quickly before we finish. So if you want to do that.
I just want to add one last word, because this is all really pretty harrowing and maybe demoralizing for people. I think it's important to just remind ourselves that fundamentally what's happening here is people are contending for the public narrative. What is anti-Semitism? What do Jewish Americans want? And things like this event are maybe one of the most important ways to push back. You know, there's probably people on the call who support Jewish Currents. That's awesome. Or, you know, whatever, the Jewish Liberation Organization, whose name I can't just remember in this moment. I mean, this is what you have to, this is not something you should like, oh my God, give up. This is too hard. The other people have so much money. This isn't going to be won by throwing the same amount of money and beating them in money. The fact is, this is about a fight for ideas, right? And Jewish Americans care about, I would say, raised with integrity, truth, free speech. These are things that matter. So conversations like this, supporting organizations that are engaged in this work, that are engaged in pushing back and setting the record straight and educating and preserving rights, it's critical. So I don't want people to walk away from this going, oh my God, this is like, it isn't. It's scary. But there's work to be done, and Jewish Currents is doing it, other people are doing it, and IfNotNow is doing it, and they should be happy about that and excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Really, thank you for saying that, Laura. I think that's true. And I know, at least for me, being able to be part of those spaces and, involved with some of that work in the past few years has been really amazing and made a big difference. And it is very exciting to see that continue to grow despite what we're up against. So thank you so much. Really appreciate the panelists being here. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to IfNotNow and Jewish Liberation Fund for hosting this with Jewish Currents. I hope that you all will stay in touch with all these organizations. I believe that the links to various websites have been in the chat: jewishliberation.fund, ifnotnowmovement.org. Jewish Currents is at jewishcurrents.org. Encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter and our print issue. We've got a pretty good one coming out later this summer that I think you'll really enjoy. So thank you so much. Hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.